turn things over to Melody and James for the presentation of the report. To ground us in the why, and I spoke about it a little bit, why is this charter review process important? Three things that we really talked about. First, charter change has an impact. I think anybody who's watched the Portland charter change process knows that changing the form of government has an impact on how it operates, so really important. Second, the piece that I talked about, which is the education and engagement piece. The process itself is an important part of our democracy at work. It is a chance for people to get to know their government. It is a chance for them to engage with their government. And I think what we're seeing at a national level, in part, many other things, is a citizenry that has become disconnected from its government. So really important, the process itself. And of course, we want a good process so that we have really sound recommendations and that we have community buy-in on those recommendations. And then the third, we think charter review processes are always important, but there is something about this moment in time that we think makes this one especially pivotal. Folks have referenced unhappiness, frustration with local government and services. That is one reason we need to get citizens engaged and residents engaged in thinking about their form of government. We are coming on the heels of the Portland process, so I think there are ways in which people have really been primed to engage by the terrific process that Portland led. And then third, I think we can't ignore what's happening at a federal level, the chaos, the backsliding of democracy, that's what I believe. And so more important than ever that we are shoring up our democracy in local government in all of the ways that we have available to us. So that's the why. I am going to turn it over to Melanie to talk about how we did our work, and then James is going to present our recommendations. As Caitlin said, we've divided this into two halves. The first half is the report. We want to get your feedback and questions and comments on this phase one report. The second phase of our process of our work is going to be to actually discuss and make recommendations about substantive charter changes. And so the second part of this evening is to tee up that conversation. We would like to hear from you as to things you think are really important that we should be considering in the charter review process. And don't worry, you don't need to know about the county charter in order to voice those opinions. We want to hear what's important to you, what are you concerned about as we take on the next phase of the work, which is to actually think about charter change recommendations. So with that, Melanie.
Thanks, Sushila. I'm going to be quick on talking a little bit about how we did this. It's important because you have to have a good process to have a good result. I know it's the boring bit, but it is what must be said. Smoking the Bear beats me every time. Because it has to be a fair and open process. So we started by looking at the last Multnomah County Charter Review Committee. They did a report on their process and had a series of recommendations. So we started with their recommendations, but we wanted to look beyond just what they thought. So we looked at two largely different areas. One is that we conducted interviews with 9 different people who represented former Multnomah County committee members, charter committee members, Multnomah County employees, and some Portland charter committee members. We didn't look at the other 2 counties. People ask me why. Clackamas County doesn't have a charter. That's a good reason not to. And Washington County does have a system, but it's ad hoc. The county commission asks for a committee. They've got 20 days to come up with a recommendation. It's not the same kind of animal. So we interviewed those people, and then we looked at other jurisdictions, either counties or cities, that had something similar to the system that we had, because that would allow us to compare to an extent apples to apples, but also that had a different take on how they would do it. So the 3 choices were King County up in Seattle area, Minneapolis, which we often use as a comparison point, it's about the same size as us, and LA City actually, because theirs is new and they're looking at how they're going to do it from here on out. So based on those interviews and based on those, the advice that was passed along by those other counties or cities that did it, we came up with our own set of recommendations on what would be the best process going forward. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Melanie. So I'm going to talk to you about the substance of the recommendations themselves. We are looking at, we did in this portion, as was mentioned by my colleagues, we're looking at the process itself and not the substantive issues. We split this into two phases. So all the recommendations you're going to hear about today are recommendations about the commission's process to get there. We're not giving any sort of recommendations related to what should eventually end up on the ballot. Okay, I want to make that really clear. These are two different phases. Okay. With that in mind, we came to the conclusion in our report, which as I mentioned is on the table if you want to take a look at it, that we have 6 broad categories of recommendations. So those broad categories are administrative support, which is essentially support for the county staff themselves. So it's our recommendations that we think will help the county office that oversees this do the best possible job in implementing charter reform. The second category is recruitment and member support. So that's recruitment of the actual commission members themselves and then support once they are in place so that, again, that they can do the best possible job that they can. The next category is community engagement. As was mentioned, this is something that we saw from other jurisdictions as being a much more fundamental part of the process that they did than it was in the prior process done by the county. So we see this as being a big change that can really help implement the process. Community engagement before the process begins to educate people and to help with the recruitment, and community engagement during the process to make sure that the public is directly involved in the eventual recommendations of the commission. And then the next bucket is voter education. Now this is different from community engagement because voter education is about educating the voters on the eventual recommendations made by the commission. So once the commission finishes meeting, they've wrapped up their work, and they've given their report to the county board, then the voter education would begin. And this is an important process in making sure that before the voters get their ballots and arrive at their conclusion on how they're going to vote, that they understand what it is that they're voting on. So that's different than the community engagement role that came before it. The last two buckets are really they overlap a bit with the other buckets because obviously recognize anything that we're recommending is going to have a cost that comes along with it. So we looked at the other jurisdictions, we looked at the past process, and we tried to make our best recommendation in the area of what we think a budget should be. We tried not to be too prescriptive in this, and I'll talk about it when we get to it, because we really didn't want to say you need to spend $10 on this, $20 on this, but we really tried to give a broad range and talk about percentages so that we still give the county a lot of leeway in how they implement it. And then finally, the timeline is the last bucket. So it really just talks about, for the process part, not the issue part, where we think that they need to start at their earliest to make sure that they have a good ability to get all of the work done that they need to get done. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to move into the first bucket. Now I'm going to cover each recommendation. I'm not going to go super heavy into detail because I want to make sure that we have lots of time to get to the conversation portion. But please, if you have questions about a specific recommendation, we'd be more than happy to talk about it and flesh it out in that conversation portion that comes next. So there are 3 specific recommendations that come under administrative support. The first is that we think that it should include 3 separate roles. So again, to clarify, this is staff that the county is providing to support the commission in their process. Last time around, the county provided 0.8 FTE or full-time positions to do this work, and pretty much everybody we talked to said that it's just not really enough to do the scope of work that needs to be done on this. So we're recommending 3 separate roles. One would be a project manager that would sort of oversee the work generally. One would be involved more in the community engagement and the communication side, public facing, and then one would be more involved in facilitation. We're pretty happy if the county decides they want to mess that up or have different things, but we definitely think they need more specific staff support than they've had in the past. The second recommendation is that the project manager should really be in place as soon as there's money to do this so that they can be involved in every step of the process. Last time around, the staff that was not brought in until after the commission had already been formed. They weren't really a part of developing pre-work and getting ready, and we think that's a fundamental part of what the project manager needs. So they need to be there from the beginning as early as possible so they can be involved. And then the staff after that, we really think that they need to have really relevant experience in county government, in the work that's being done. And if they're lacking, if there are gaps in that experience, we need to make sure that they're properly educated and they get some training before they really take over, which is why they really need to be in place before the commission starts their work when they're all formed. Okay? Our next bucket of recommendations is recruitment and member support. So first of all, we think that the county needs to look at and do a really good job of defining what the county is looking for prior to the recruitment process. And when I get to the timeline, I'll show that we think the recruitment process needs to begin as early as possible when that fiscal year begins, next fiscal year. So because of that, we really think the county needs to be starting in this fiscal year and working to kind of define what they're going to be looking for so they can hit the ground running in that recruitment process. Last time, the recruitment process in the charter itself changed due to some amendments, so the recruitment process is going to be a little bit different, and there needs to be some work done by the county and what it is that they're going to be expecting out of that. Then we think that they need to conduct robust recruitment, and that should include hiring a community-based organization. We saw from a number of other jurisdictions that they involved community-based organization in order to assist with community recruitment, especially to community members that may be underserved in the public. We think community-based organizations have a unique ability to fill that role where the county government may not be able to fill that role directly. So we are recommending that they involve community-based organization in that way. We think they need to hold town halls in each district in order to introduce the charter review process. We talked earlier about one of the things we think is really important is that a lot of people just don't know what the county does. They don't know what a charter review process is. They don't know what the county is responsible for, what they're going to be looking for. So we think they need to go out to each district and especially make sure that they have both East Portland and cities outside of Gresham in East County to make sure that they're really getting to those people that wouldn't normally hear or be involved in the process. Then they need to make sure they equip members with the resources and supports needed to succeed. This is really just stating what the commission last time already stated, that they need better and more support for the members themselves. This starts with more staff, but it follows through with facilitation and community engagement all the way from the beginning all the way through to the end. And then finally in this bucket is selecting alternates who fully participate in all but the voting. So we know that there have been problems in other jurisdictions where we saw in our research where if a member had to step out and there wasn't an alternate immediately available, it takes a lot of work to get those people up to speed. So we think that it's an important part of the process to have somebody there in all but voting so that if someone for some reason has to step out, you can just keep right on rolling and you don't have to go back to the drawing board or be down a member. Okay. Our next bucket is community engagement. Now I really want to stress this at least, and I think a lot of my colleagues agree that I think this is something where we think is going to be a fundamental difference to how it was done last time. Last time around in the county, there really wasn't an effort to do community engagement until way too late in the process. Outside organizations were brought in, but by then a lot of decisions had already been made. We think community engagement needs to happen before there even is a commission and helping with recruitment, and then all the way through the process so that they're a fundamental part of deciding what issues are even going to be talked about by the commission themselves. So the committee and the staff should develop a community engagement plan from the start. In our timeline when we get to it, we talk about they should already be putting out an RFP if they're going to involve an organization outside of the county, but the county themselves needs to have a plan well before the commission is in place. They should use a variety of methods during their outreach. So it shouldn't just be, they send out a newsletter or they update a newsletter or they have sort of one source. We know through experience that the public responds to different forms of communication differently, and different members of the public might see something differently depending on how it's given to them. So we really want there to be a robust method, from broad things, social media, paid media, down to community level organization and peer-to-peer education levels. Then we think they need to retain a community-based organization for support. Just as we said with the recruitment, we think community organizations can fill a really important role that the county can't necessarily fulfill themselves in connecting the county to voters and members of the community who just don't feel that there can be a part of this process through government itself. The last recommendation in this bucket is that they should include methods that will reach a broad variety of stakeholders. So not just in the methods themselves being diverse so that different people that learn differently can get reached, but we really want to make sure that we're not just showing up for people that live downtown, we're not just showing up for people that are going to be voting next year, that really from one side of the county to the other side, that every community gets a part of this engagement and feels like they're a part of that process. The next bucket is voter education. As I said before, I'm going to clarify the difference between this and community engagement. This process begins when the commission's job is done. So the commission finishes, they make their recommendations, they hand it off to the county board. At that point, we think it's really important that you're not done with the work as the county. At that point, the voters may have not been engaged enough. They may not know what's going on. They may not understand the recommendations. We certainly saw this in the previous processes where people felt like they didn't really know what was going to be on the ballot or they were confused about it at times. We've seen that in past processes. So this is where that begins. August through November of 2028, it's going to be an important process for that to happen. So we think that they should begin voter education early enough that the Oregon Secretary of State's office can be involved. They can do a review of this process and be involved, but we need to make sure they should be in it from as early as they are willing to be in it, because they have to be able to give a non-partial review of what's going to be on the ballot itself. The second recommendation is that you include a variety of methods that incorporate different ways people learn. This is sort of similar to what I talked about in community engagement. People learn differently, so just like in community engagement, we want to have different methods to reach those people. We should include education directed at voters who are typically less engaged or have less reported trust in the process. So this is something that sort of I've seen in my own experience. A lot of times when a government's going to do a voter education process, they have very standard mainstream ways of doing that, and then we check that box and we're done. But that doesn't get to the people who don't engage with government normally. There are certain processes that you need to go through to make sure that you're engaging people who have said, I don't trust government, I don't vote, I don't want to be involved. We want to make sure that those people get as much education on the topic as anybody who is in this room who are going to show up every day or come to all of the town halls that they can. Okay? Second to last bucket, and then we can transition to a conversation. So our last bucket is budget. We talked a lot about the details here, but in the end, we had a conversation that we didn't want to be too prescriptive about the budget specifically. We know that that is a complicated process that the county is going to have to make a lot of their own decisions on. So we wanted to try and give a broad spectrum, and there were two big factors that weighed on our recommendations here. The first one is that every jurisdiction we looked at outside of Multnomah County itself spent a lot more money on this process. So we were trying to give a budget recommendation that fell somewhere between sort of those highest figures, those jurisdictions that spent a lot of money, did a really, really robust process, and sort of what the county had done before. So the recommendation that we landed on is sort of a middle ground between those two over the span of time that we're talking about. The second part of these budget recommendations are that there were some charter amendments that came from the commission last cycle when they did this in 21 and 22 that did pass and are now part of the county charter. So the process will be different, and part of that is it's a longer process. It's a process that already requires more engagement of the community than it did last time around. So we're also recognizing that even if none of our recommendations were taken into account, which we hope isn't the case, but even if none of those recommendations are taken into account, the budget will likely have to grow just to sort of do the same that they did last year. And that could be as much as doubling the budget just based on the amount of time that's been added in the charter itself. So going over this budget itself, we landed on a number, overall budget of between $900,000 and $1.5 million, and that spans a little over the 2 years of that process. Some of our recommendations involve some things happening right before the fiscal year happens, and some of those things obviously may take place later on after the commission is done. So we say just over 2 years. And then we broke it down by percentages. We kind of wanted to give some leeway here because this is sort of how it broke down in our conversations, but we can understand if different criteria fall or only portions of our recommendations are taken, these percentages would change depending on which recommendations were taken and which were not. To kind of cover it in a large, big picture, it largely comes down to about 50% being staff time and about 50% being the costs of engagement and voter education and outreach. And then the last bucket is timeline. And there's just a few things here that kind of come in order that we think are important. This is not an overly detailed, July 2026 through the November 2028 timeline, but it's sort of things that we think need to happen by a certain time in order to give the commission its best chance possible. The first one is allocating the recommended resources leading up to the fiscal year. As I mentioned, there may be some things that need to be done, such as we talked about making decisions about the type of recruitment that they want to do or the type of commissioners they want to have. That's things that need to happen leading up to the fiscal year. And then as soon as money becomes available on July 1, we recommend hiring that project manager right away. They really need to be involved as early as possible so they can be a part of that process, be a part of that decision making, and be a part of understanding what the county wants out of this. Once the project manager is on, they can hire those additional staff that we are recommending soon after that. Then we think they should release an RFP or request for proposals for community engagement. So if the county is going to go outside and do engagement, which is what they did last cycle, to an organization outside of the county itself, we think those requests for proposals should be out at least by October so that we can get through that process. Earlier, obviously, is always better, but we really want to make sure they have time to be on board and ready to go prior to the commission starting. Then they want to begin recruitment of members as soon as possible in order to finish by December 2026. We think that that's the goal. We think it really depends on the county and how long that process takes. We think, starting right at July 1st is probably a good idea, giving it the full 6 months so they can really have a deep, robust recruitment process. But it's really going to be up to the county to figure out what's involved there. And then finally, we're going to provide onboarding on January and February of 2027 for the members before their first meeting by charter is designated to happen in March. So we're recommending they have onboarding the 2 months prior to that. And then the final recommendation is that after these have been delivered to the board, that voter education should commence in August through November of 2028. So we already talked about that. This is the timeline it should happen. Okay. That was a lot. We wanted to make sure that even if you had not read the report, that you really understand what our recommendations are. So I've talked for a long time about a lot of things, and then I think we can now shift to having a conversation about this.
And while you're thinking about what we really want your questions, we want your feedback, while you're thinking about that, I guess I'll mention, and maybe I should have up front, the purpose of this process report is to really inform the Multnomah County Commissioners, the Board of Commissioners, as they are planning the next budget, so that they've got this set of recommendations in mind to think about and to build community engagement and understanding even before the review process happens, so that we've got community members saying, hey, this process is important, we want to make sure that people are engaged, we support an investment of resources, because that is a significant ask in a time when budgets are tight. It's a significant ask, and we talked a lot about the size of that budget that we're proposing, but really felt that this is, you can think of it as civic infrastructure, right? It is easy to say the things that matter are the services that affect people directly, and those are incredibly important, but that doesn't happen well unless you get your civic infrastructure in place, and we really see this as being civic infrastructure. So that was the purpose of this, really spending time on the process, which, I think many people will find the juicier part to be the second part, which is the actual substantive recommendations. But we think this may not be quite as juicy, but it's just as important. So really appreciate your being here and participating.